Again, I'm Laura DeNardis, and it's a pleasure to be moderating this lunch keynote discussion on the future of digital technologies for international affairs. The question really is, how will technological changes affect relationships between the states? We know that diplomats and foreign services have already had to adapt their approaches and methods in new and creative ways around technological changes. We also know that economic development and aid really has turned its attention to the role that digital technologies can play. But at the same time, there have been these discussions around governance of the internet that have emerged as an extremely significant issue in international affairs. So helping us to understand these various intersections are two ambassadors who are experts in these issues. I'll introduce them briefly. You can look at the bios, which are, of course, very lengthy. But Ambassador Sepulveda on my left is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, and he's the U.S. Coordinator for International Communications and Information Policy. And Ambassador Djani is Permanent Representative of the Republic of Indonesia to the United Nations. So we're thrilled to have both of them here. We want to thank you both for taking time out of your schedule to join us. And I think, if I may, I will turn to Ambassador Sepulveda first for some remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Professor DeNardis, and thank you, Ambassador, for coming out and doing this. The Ambassador and I saw each other in Jakarta last maybe a year or two ago. Indonesia is a critically important actor in this conversation and in this space. We believe in the work that we're doing that the future of the internet, and in large part the future of the degree to which it remains a single global platform for innovation, discourse, and activity, will rely on the ability to ensure that we are inclusive, it's a broad conversation, and that we win the hearts and minds of people in countries like Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, India, where the numbers are very large of human beings but are not yet connected to the platform in the kinds of numbers that we would like to see. So as we move forward, we need to ensure that the internet and the global communications platform remain and continue to act as a force for not just economic development, but for increasing opportunity in every form. One of the opportunities that I've had over the last 3.5 years, I've led two major negotiations. One was at the Plenipotentiary in 2014 of the ITU, which was the next major ITU treaty conference after the WICET that Gordon covered earlier. And at the 2014 Plenipotentiary, we were able to reach consensus on all matters before the ITU. It was a 3-week conference. I led a 130-some person delegation to those negotiations, and there were multiple negotiations ongoing at the same time. And again, we were able to bring the 193 countries of the United Nations together on the proper scope and role of the ITU and restore some degree of consensus in the body. Then last year at the World Summit on the Information Society +10 review, we again were able to achieve a consensus outcome. It's an outcome that we're extremely proud of. And ultimately, one of the things that I'm most proud of within the outcomes of the WSIS +10 review is that we agreed as a United Nations that we would not measure the quality and the health of the information society solely by the economic benefits that are returned to it, but by the degree to which it enables the exercise of human rights. That was a very big moment for us in those conversations. And I can go into detail about both of those negotiations to the degree that you all would wish to do that. I think one of the big things that I've come out from this, and having heard the last panel, is that I am dramatically more optimistic about what is happening in this space and where we're headed than I heard from the last panel. This is a truly fascinating time. It's a truly fascinating conversation, and we will have events like this almost every week somewhere in the world. In 2 weeks, I will be going to the WSIS Forum in Geneva. The United States has been asked to chair that forum, and I will be chairing it on behalf of the United States. And again, you're going to hear many conversations about the things that we're talking about here in that space. We will then later in the year have the OECD do a digital ministerial in Cancun, Mexico, which I will be vice chairing for the United States, but which Ms. Pritzker will be coming down, Secretary Pritzker will be coming down to, as well as my colleague Larry Strickling. at NTIA, and I believe my boss, Kathy Novelli, will as well, talking about the different aspects of internet governance through that organization. And then later in the year, we will have the Internet Governance Forum, also in Mexico this year, and the Freedom Online Coalition Conference in Costa Rica this year, all of which, to some degree, speaks to the rising importance of Latin America in this space. And we organize our negotiations in the ITU through CTEL, which is our regional organization of my counterparts throughout the Americas. And I really believe that when the Americas come together on a question, and there are some real unifying values here, we are able to carry the day in international organizations. And I spent a lot of time trying to forge and work on relationships in Latin America. I'm very bullish on where we're headed in Latin America, and really excited about those prospects as well. But I also believe that India's move towards support for the multi-stakeholder system, which they've declared publicly, is critically important. And we can have a long and interesting conversation about all the issues that are surrounding this. I would also want to note and plug the most recent event and initiative that we've started, which is the Global Connect Initiative, in which one of the things that we've come to the conclusion on is that everyone agrees that everyone should be connected to the internet. That's where the agreement stops. Everything above that leads to lots of debate, and even the how of it, how everyone should be connected to the internet can lead to debate. But the fact that the internet should be universally affordable and accessible is something that we all agree on. And we want to target through the multitude of efforts that are taking place, plus bringing in new actors like the development banks and the development community into the fold in the effort of connecting the remaining 3 to 4 billion people on the planet who are not connected to the internet. Because I think that the worst outcome that could come from the development and deployment of the information society is that it lead to greater inequality. The ability for us to access these networks enables us to continue growing exponentially faster than those who cannot. And we have both a moral, social, foreign policy, economic policy, democratic policy responsibility to ensure that we use the forces of the market in our ability through public-private partnerships to enable that kind of connectivity around the world. And that's something that people are working on through multiple different projects, and we thought that there needed to be some cohesion and an umbrella mechanism for bringing those efforts together. And we initiated that process at the World Bank last week or 2 weeks ago with the president of the World Bank and the Secretary of State leading a group of ministers of finance from around the world in a conversation on the financing of that challenge. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, and thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dean Merigiano, for having me here, as well as Laura for being the moderator for today. And as Ambassador Sepulveda mentioned, I think he alluded to many of the instances that the international community has been working within the context of the internet itself. But maybe before going to that particular question that Laura mentioned, what would be the role of the UN, United Nations, as well as the international community? The point that I would like to raise first of all is the changing attitude or the changing modus of operandi with vis-a-vis international relations in the context of the actor itself. I mean the diplomats. I just came back after 25 years having a stint here in the United Nations just last month, and I see there are lots of changes even in the conduct of diplomacy. Before we were still doing the old line of diplomacy where the physical context is the most important. The face-to-face approach is the most important part of the whole diplomatic affairs. But now there is different modus, different way of doing things, and that is being changed simply because of the internet. In the old Nicholson book, they always say that when it comes to the issue of diplomacy, there is the question of reporting, promotion, and then negotiating, and of course protecting your citizen. In the issue of protecting, for instance, the internet is still at very early stages. I mean, you have all this e-form to be filled on every consular practices. You want to apply for a passport, those kind of things. That has been the conduct of diplomacy since way back. But on the issue of the physical protection of an American citizen or an Indonesian citizen, then you still have to have the diplomat physically in the field in trying to do that. On the issue of promoting itself, there is a changing way of doing it. Some embassies, some mission have done a one-way street, meaning you have a web site where you are promoting Indonesia tourism, promoting Indonesian trade, those kind of things, one-way street. But now the tendency is also changing where you have to have a two-way street of trying to promote your country. And this is where the difficulty arises on the question of diplomacy and the conduct of diplomacy. Meaning, you like it or not, you have to go to social media. And when you go to social media, then there is the question of real-time diplomacy. If you try to tweet a message through the Twitter, then you also have the danger of having to be able to also respond quickly. And that's where sometimes the lack time of diplomacy, whereby lots of countries have to seek position back home, views, and that also becomes an issue, whereby when you're having a lot of questions being raised on your policies, and there's always a tweak here and there. I've seen lots of my colleagues in even some developed countries having problems. There are ambassadors being fired simply because he's too affirmative action, I would say, to Twitter-like, and at the end of the day, he was being bullied by lots of people, and he's not able to respond. So this is a changing way of diplomacy. The more important part is on the question of negotiation part, and that's where the new digital age brings into action of should we negotiate through the internet. Of course, you can easily send your draft through the internet, but once again, the question of security there lies, the question of whether that particular draft comes from the certain person that you are negotiating. Well, that's where the most important part at the end of the day, diplomacy has to be face-to-face, is on the question of negotiating any text. Because you have to read the body language, you have to read the way, you have to be trustworthy in a sense. So the issue then, I see some panelists before was referring to this issue of trust. And diplomacy relies very much on the question of trust. And then the $6 million question is the internet trustworthy enough for the conduct of diplomacy? Now, with all this important points that I've raised, comes to the crux of the matter, which is the content of diplomacy itself. And this is where Laura's question comes into being. Should we discuss internet, or should we discuss the substance of the internet itself? What I'm trying to say here is that the question arises whether you want to govern internet or not, or should you discuss internet or not. Every country in the world acknowledges the fact that internet is important. I think nobody has any qualms on that particular issue. But the devil is always in the details. How far do you want to discuss the internet issue itself? Do you want to go to the question of cyber threat? Do you want to go to the question of IPR itself? You want to go to the question of e-commerce? I was before involved in the WTO negotiation on the moratorium on e-commerce, which is in the 90s, late 90s. That was almost, 15 years, 20 years ago. Even to have the question, not discussing internet itself or internet commerce itself, just the question of having a moratorium not to impose any tax on the free flow of electronic commerce itself was already a big, quite battle, so to say. We're not even discussing the question of the services part or the trade facilities in part or those kind of part within the context of WTO. Then you have the issue of where should we discuss it if we want to discuss the issue of internet in the multilateral complex. Should it be done by the United Nations? Should it be done by agencies or specialized agencies within the context of the United Nations? And well, you know, the language here in many part of multilateral discussion is everybody wants to discuss every issues. And sometimes that's where the duplication comes into being. IPR, should it be discussed in the context of WIPO? Should it be discussed within the context of the WTO? It can also be discussed within the context of the UN system, whereby you have the development aspect of it. We just had recently the meeting of the high-level thematic debate for the Sustainable Development Goals. Just last week it was. We have seen hundreds of ministers, the head of delegation, head of state making statement. Was wondering also in that meeting how far the internet would be touched upon in their statement, and have not seen that many. We had a hearing. I posed this question to would be Secretary General of the United Nations on how they would look at the internet issues. Well, maybe there were so many questions, the question was not yet answered in sense. So what does that shows? That shows that internet is not sexy enough to be discussed in the international forum, or we don't know how to approach it. Or should it be a multi-stakeholder approach whereby not only government officials should discuss it? So this is the question that arises when one wants to discuss whether it has a change on internal affairs. Last point that I want to raise is that this issue has been discussed in many forums, like Daniel mentioned also. Of course, there was lots of discussion here and there. But the one more important point that raised the issue is that not only the content, as I mentioned itself, but also where does country lies on the whole setting. This is the one issue that even the balance of everything is quite different. For instance, if you're discussing financing for development, it's quite clear who is against what. When it comes to internet, the player is so very, there are middle level income, there are other type of countries, and that's where even the terminology, Laura, is quite different. Before we'd have what we call the LDCs, now we have the LCCs, less connected countries, and they amounted for quite a large number of countries. If I can go to the data itself, it's quite huge, and that's what I'm a bit worried also. If there's going to be a discussion of internet, who should discuss it? Is it those that own the technology or those that own the IPs? And at the end of the day, would that be the most important issue to be discussed when you still have the question of poverty, you have the question of economics, you have the question of sustainable development to be tackled? I was just, if you look at the data itself, out of the 17, the goals of the SDG, you have 69 targets. And there's only one target on internet access. That's one thing that I was wondering also, where has the whole discussion gone by? So not trying to raise all this quote unquote grim picture of the discussion, but just to a point to ponder is, do we want to govern internet? And when we do want to govern internet itself, who shall govern it? And where should we govern it? I think I'll stop by making that very important point in the last.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We will queue up some questions from the audience, but I think I will start with one question that ties together something that you both said. You both mentioned the term multi-stakeholder internet governance and how that's important not only for ensuring human rights as well as development, inequality on the internet, but also for carrying out the changing nature of digital diplomacy and other issues as well. So at the same time as we have the multi-stakeholder model in the international arena, there are also a number of questions that are pushing back against that model. We have, some things have already been mentioned here today. We have cyber sovereignty discussions taking place in some countries where there's a reassertion of a bordered view of the internet. There are specific initiatives such as data localization laws. There's quantitative evidence that there's a loss of trust in the international system. And of course we have the ICANN transition that is in the works, and the question about how that will unfold. So given that this is a digital futures forum, I want to ask both of you to look into the future and to give us your read on how this tension between the private sector-led multi-stakeholder model of the internet and these increasing, or even if not increasing, but the continuous movements toward reasserting national sovereignty and multilateral approaches will unfold. Let's not even say in the next decade, but the next 5 years. And then we will bring the mic out, and if anyone would like the mic, please raise your hand, and that will come to you.
Well, look, the United States is kind of an evangelist for the internet. We very strongly believe in the multi-stakeholder system of internet governance. We believe that the internet was a gift from the United States to the world. The creation of it And I'm extremely proud to represent the United States in these international organizations and talk about the internet and its creation and its use as a democratizing force, an ability for individuals to use it, to express themselves, to create new services, to deliver new services. And when we talk about the internet, I think it's too simplistic to talk about the internet. Right? The internet is not like the climate. It wasn't created by God, it was created by man, and there are thousands of networks connected to each other, countless applications that ride over those networks. And when we focus on consumer-facing World Wide Web services, we leave out a lot of what the internet enables. Supply chain management, traditional human resources management across multinational firms, government service delivery, any number of other aspects of what enables the internet. And then beyond that, when we think about what's going to be in 5 years, the internet, I think it was Steve Case who just wrote that if you talk about the internet economy, is kind of like talking about the economy of electricity. It just is, right? Everything will be connected to the network in some way or another and be dependent on communications and the ability of global communications to flow freely and for people to use the information that they gather from that free flow of data to the best of their ability to create wealth and opportunity. So that our job and our desire is to retain what is good and creates opportunity and prosperity over the internet. And when we are challenged by our colleagues abroad relative to sovereignty issues, what we urge is at a very minimum to accept that don't accept multi-stakeholder processes for ideological reasons, but accept them as a necessity to achieving effectively whatever it is you wish to achieve. Because you have to work with the people who know how the networks operate, who have invented the networks, and who use the networks in order to do whatever it is that you want to achieve with those networks. You want a more secure, safer network? Okay, we do too. We are not the experts on that question. We in government are not the experts on that question. It requires those who operate networks, those who use networks, and those the technologists who study cybersecurity all the time to work on solutions. And some solutions, it really should be problem-based and strategically targeted at solving a specific problem, and then you want to bring as many minds to bear on that problem as possible. That's ultimately what the multi-stakeholder system means to me.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Ambassador Djani.
Well, I think the question of the multi-stakeholder process is a fact of life. You can't avoid it. When we discuss the question of internet, then we have to, I agree completely with Ambassador Sepulveda, government can't do everything when it comes to the internet. It has to have the process of the NGOs, you have to have the IT people, the technology part, the infrastructure. But the question then would be, what sort of discussion that you're expecting from a multi-stakeholders approach? If the end outcome is to have an agreement, like it or not, it has to be done by government-to-government type of negotiation. Of course, input or part of the delegation would also consist of multi-stakeholders. But unless the international treaty agreement still exists, that only country can bind itself together in some sort of an agreement where they have a sort of dispute settlement mechanism, there's a reward and punishment type of an approach. But if it's some sort of a non-binding guidelines where you conceive of norms of best practices type of a thing, then definitely a multi-stakeholder approach certainly would be the way of doing it. So once again, what would be the end game that we're looking for when we're discussing internet? This is and one important point also, if one wants to try to discuss a sort of agreement in terms of internet, would one try to do it in a whole comprehensive type of a package, or you want to separate it in person by person and look at what particular issues that are important enough to have an agreement upon? For instance, on the question of cyber threat or cyber terrorism. Like it or not, now there are certain views that you need to discuss it, and government needs to work together on that, including with multi-stakeholder. That is one thing that people will be keen to try to discuss. But when it comes to the whole comprehensive package of internet, meaning the IP part, the development part, the access part, then that's another story altogether.
Thank you. And we had a question from this table, Sir David Oman, and I don't see the microphone out there, but I think we'll be able to hear you.
I'll speak loudly. My question is this. How far can we rely on the hidden hand of the market to ensure that the less connected countries do get connected? That the internet connection points actually get built where, in terms of social need, they ought to be built, when perhaps some of the commercial priorities might point somewhere else. The parallel in my mind are the issues that the Gates Foundation is wrestling with World Health, where the pharmaceutical companies, it isn't necessarily in their commercial interest to put the priority to trialing new treatments for certain diseases and to deliver the products at prices that can actually be afforded in the countries that are affected by those. So you have market failure. What's the answer in relation to the internet and connecting up the next 3 billion users?
I think that the health example is kind of an imperfect analogy. To the degree that the distribution of pharmaceuticals doesn't benefit from network effects. Every additional user to the network brings value to every additional user, to every other user on the network. There is an inherent self-interest in having, for network operators and for the deliverers of services over the internet, to deliver it to as many people as possible. So market forces actually work really well in this particular space. Where they do not work, but they work decreasingly well where there are very poor people or where there are very not densely populated people, right? Because the cost per person of connection rises exponentially. And in those cases, you need some form of public-private partnership in order to reach individuals. I would take a step back because I've had this debate with my friends from my colleagues from the G77 many, many times. That there's been an argument that somehow the market isn't, that there is a market failure, that the market isn't adequately addressing the needs of connectivity of the developing world. And as a result of that, we need to either do some sort of intellectual property transfer from the developed world to the developing world or some form of taxation, cross-subsidization from the developed world to the developing world. I would say two things. One, any imposition of a tax regime across borders would distort the flow of commerce and it would distort the flow of data because people would try to flow data around whatever taxation regime you wanted to impose. Second, I would say that the glass is dramatically more half full than half empty. We are at 3 billion people connected to the network since basically the 1990s, right? And we are, today, there are more submarine cable landings by a factor of 3 to 4 around the coast of Africa than there were 2 or 3 years ago. And we can see multiple initiatives coming out of the private sector, everything from SpaceX to some of the things that Facebook is doing to the Google Loon project to I think it's OneWeb is the other initiative. There are multiple people trying to crack this particular nut, right? And what our job, I believe, as governments is to enable that kind of activity and innovation. So for example, the ITU is responsible for managing access to the airwaves around the world, for ensuring that we come together and agree that there should be a mechanism by which low Earth orbit satellites can or cannot use the space and the spectrum necessary to reach, particularly people who live in places that are landlocked. That's where you're going to have real issues of network connectivity. Now, my job is to go there and say, yes, this is a good idea, and this is why we should do it, and try to manage incumbent interests and make sure that everyone is treated fairly. But I do believe that our greatest likelihood of success lies not in supplanting the market system. And I am a progressive. I believe in a role for government. I believe in a role for regulation, and I believe in a role for public-private partnerships. I believe in the Universal Service Fund in the United States, for example. And I believe that we have a communal responsibility to connect everyone in the world to the network. The question is, what is the most effective mechanism for doing that? And those are the kinds of debates that we have all the time in the discussions that we're having. But by that same token, I think we should pay due consideration and due respect for what's been achieved. In the history of networks in the world, you have never had a rollout of a network globally to the degree that you have now. I think someone had said that 3G is covering at least 90% of the world's population. Not land, but population. And the mobile connectivity of the world will at some point over the next 5 or 10 years dramatically increase the number of people connected to that network. Now that doesn't solve all of the problems that come from having people connected to a network, but that means that there will just be a lot of work for us to do going forward.
On that particular point, Sir David's question is, one has to look at it once again, what kind of countries that you're referring to. If it's a developed countries, middle-income developed countries, or those countries that have quite large population like Indonesia. We have 17,800 plus island, to be frank. We don't have the right correct amount of the island because depending on the tide goes up, we lose another 300 islands. Tide goes down, we have another 200 islands. But how to connect all those people in those islands? We're working, like you mentioned, with the balloon, Google Loon, having this balloon going up to have the access. But that is country like Indonesia, where you have 250 million people, where there are ample economic opportunities for the market to play into the game. I mean, companies will certainly come to Indonesia easily because they see the profit of having those access of internet for all those people in the island. They can have the e-commerce coming in, they have all those financial transactions through the internet. But what happened to those, what I mentioned as the LCC? And that's where the invisible hand, like you mentioned, or the hidden hand, or Adam Smith hand, might not necessarily work. If you look at the data of the ITU, for instance, the ITU lists 42 countries with low level of ICT access and usage. At least this is what we call by the least connected countries, the LCC. Close to 2.5 billion people live in the LCCs. This is 1/3 of the world population. Whether internet access or usage and broadband subscription, the differences can reach up to 40% between developing and developed countries. Then the question would be, would a particular company come to those countries which has less than 10 million population, where you don't have enough capabilities, potential for economic growth, and what should we do for these countries? Maybe the idea of a WTO where you have an SNDs provision, special and differential treatment, whereby for those countries you can have incentives, you can have subsidies going on without being brought to any WTO dispute settlement, if you're talking about the trade part, was another way of doing it. But if there is not special treatment for those countries, at the end of the day, the one that will be having the quote-unquote profit or benefit from the internet are those that's already middle income or middle and upward countries, and we're going to be left to a lot of other issues that will be coming to being. I'm not trying to be sarcastic here, David. It's just being realistic because, we're in much better position in Indonesia as a country, but I can assure you there are those that are LDCs or LCCs that really need the help to have the access. And that's where international cooperation comes into being. And that's where we have to develop the mechanism or the discussion to ensure that there are certain treatment that are given. As simple as that. Otherwise, they can create to other issues of non-internet issues, which will certainly affect the issue of cyber terrorists or terrorists for that matter. Poverty brings a lot of other problems into the fold.
Ambassador.
I just want to differ a little bit on that. I do think that lesser connected countries or least connected countries need special attention. But I would, in the cases that I've seen, where there have been both in small and isolated communities or poor communities, a significant part of the problem is not the market, but policies that are inhibiting the market from being able to participate in that particular place. So when you have discriminatory tax regimes, for example, or you have mandatory manufacturing on handsets in a given country, or you have a monopoly, an incumbent telephone monopoly that is not subject to competition in a given country, or any number of other policies, rules against foreign direct investment, any number of other policies, you're going to find, and there are case studies of countries that don't have those things that come from the developing world that are doing quite well. You can look at Colombia that did a reverse auction system under Diego Molano and has 90% of all towns in Colombia covered. You look at Chile, has 72% penetration, right? And these are as a function of policy decisions, right? And I do think that there is a place where the market will cease to pursue a consumer or pursue a user. But that places a lot further from where we are right now. And at that point, there does need to be some sort of either loan subsidization mechanism through systems like the development banks or domestic assistance agencies. But as a general rule, this market has, and particularly in the services of mobile telephone, I mean, I've been in places where you see people who don't have shoes but do have a cell phone. Like, they are prioritizing the acquisition of this service because it yields returns for them that are greater than the cost of access to the system. So I think that this requires a lot of rigor and study, and I completely concur that we have, again, a communal responsibility, and that there are certain pockets of the population that will not be reachable without serious assistance. But as a general rule, we still have a lot of people that we can get to simply by governing better.
Well, so far today, and I think I'll ask you a final question and give you an opportunity to make some closing remarks, either in response to the question, or if you have something else you'd like to say, that would be fine. But so far today, we've heard about a number of international affairs challenges that are raised by the global flow of digital data across borders. Some of these are jurisdictional, where there are questions about whose laws apply. Some of them, and we'll hear more about this in the cybersecurity panel, involve attribution and the difficulty in law enforcement and determining where cybersecurity attacks occur. There also there's the issue of mutual aid across borders around law enforcement, different views around control of the internet, of course. And then the issue, especially in privacy, but all areas of digital norms, different cultural approaches to what counts as freedom of expression, what counts as privacy, what can be said and done online. So we've heard about these things that exist along with the opportunities and the diffusion and spread of the internet and the economic benefits and the human rights benefits that come with that. So either in terms of the challenges or the opportunities, what would you like to see in terms of international agreements around digital data flows?
I think to some degree, I want to concur that we need much more cooperation and collaboration, both between governments and then between stakeholders, with governments, and among themselves to solve all of these challenges. Some are extremely technical and require an immense amount of technical expertise, and others are a function of the ability of our law enforcement officials, for example, to talk to each other in a system of trust and ensure that there's an adequate exchange of information. And if we don't get it right, there will be continued pressure for data localization regimes and other mechanisms by which to fragment the network and the information contained on the network. But again, I would say that the glass is more full than empty, and that there is a self-interest in getting to the right place on these issues. I would also say that there isn't going to be, for many of these issues, like I think privacy or expression, there isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all solution for everyone. What I will say is that we strongly believe that there is no sovereign right to control what people think or what people say. There is no sovereign right to control people's access to information that comes from outside their border or information that they're willing to exchange among each other. Now, by that same token, there's responsibilities that are incumbent upon all of us, both as private and public actors, to behave ethically. And that conversation is a much more complex one. A lot of times when we talk about regulating the internet or controlling the internet, what we're really talking about is people, trying to regulate people, what people do and say. And there is bad behavior by human beings, and sometimes they use technology to execute that behavior, and we need to work collaboratively to reduce that. But by that same token, we should take a moment to celebrate the utility of this communications revolution, what it's done for people around the world, and really build on it and get the rest of the world connected, because the internet builds its own constituency. Everywhere in the world where people are connected, people love the internet. They love how it works, they love what it enables. And so we just want to continue working in that space as respectfully and collaboratively as possible.
Thank you. Ambassador.
Yes, I certainly agree with Ambassador Sepulveda when it comes to the issue of people itself. And that's where when one wants to discuss this, whether to have a sort of a multilateral agreement on internet or not, like you mentioned, Laura, this issue of norms and values differs in many ways because people are different in many parts of the world. And that's where it's quite hard if you want to regulate the internet vis-a-vis issue of freedom of expression, freedom of religion, human rights, those kind of course, there is this issue of universal human rights where we're quite agreeable. But even the case of a simple issue of pornography, some countries are keen on having quote-unquote regulating pornography in the internet, some are not. I was just surprised, just last month we had an article in Times where on porn in the internet, those that are now advocating for porn to be in the internet are those that are using porn when they were 11 years old, 12 years old. This is a Time first page article, which is quite a change of even attitude in many countries, including the developed world, including America. So once again, but we need to have a sort of a gentleman's type of an understanding of what to be discussed or what not to be discussed. Because at the end of the day, not to regulate it, don't take me wrong, but there should be a cooperation in trying to address issues that we think are the negative side of the internet and try to promote the positive side of the internet. Striking the right balance of these two is the most important part, and that's where you, like in the case of human rights, you have these universalities of human rights that people agree. You can't kill people, you can't torture people. That kind of approach can be done also in the internet. We try to find certain things that we agree upon and that we should do something about. For instance, this question of cyber terrorists. I think, like it or not, we should have an international cooperation to address that, whatever that may be. Maybe Sir David is much more an expert on this than I am. On the question of access to technology or access to internet, we need to have a gentleman's agreement also that so all people of the world can also have the benefit of internet, whether you would say through market mechanism or to what other means. But we can't left, especially running to the last point of the SDG, we should not, no one should be left behind. That is a very powerful word of the SDG. And without certain assistance, whatever that may be, I agree when you're referring to Colombia, that's 50, 60 million countries. But I'm talking about the 5 million countries, like small island in the countries in the Pacific, for instance. You have 12 seats in the Pacific. Even to have a Secretary General of the United Nations visiting that area is something that does not comprehend to you or to me, to us. Or some particular LDC countries in Africa where you are landlocked. I visited those countries. Colombia is a middle-income country like Indonesia. I mean, they have lots of potential and other places. So we need to help this so that everybody will. At the end of the day, even the market, even the industry will benefit if there are so many people have access to technology. So my end point, Laura, as my closing statement is you have to balance everything. And we need to start from now trying to promote the positive side of internet and find what area that we really can work on together. Because this has to be a multi-stakeholder approach, not only as government. Because government will be easy. I can talk to him anytime, but I have also to talk to my NGOs, my business sectors and everything. And you know how many NGOs we have in the world, how many businessmen we have in the world. And that's where the beauty of the whole thing lies, if we really want to use this internet for the good of people. I'm not being a preacher today, but that I believe in that.
Excellent. Well, thank you so very much. We're going to continue this conversation in 2 breakout sessions. We're going to take a 15-minute coffee break, and then in the theater here will be the panel on the potential and pitfalls of an algorithmic society, and in the library will be the panel on cyber conflict. But in the meantime, I would like to thank you very much for your generosity in both joining us here today and ask our fellow participants to help me in thanking them.
Thank you.